Welcome, everyone, to this meeting of the London Assembly Environment Committee. Members of the public joining us today, in person and online, may like to follow @London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag Assembly Environment for this meeting. Please may I remind everyone to switch their phones to silent mode and ask that members and guests ensure that electronic devices are not placed in front of their microphones. Quorum has not been achieved. This meeting will now take place informally on a hybrid basis. We will not take formal decisions or agree the minutes of the committee's meeting on 20th of October 2022, which were included in the published agenda. Instead, the minutes will be deferred to the next formal meeting of the committee, but I'm happy to take any inquiries or comments of that item. For transparency, we will still declare any interests, and we are also able to note items. The main item on the agenda today is a discussion on the Green Bond Programme and GLA climate budgeting with our guests. However, we have some short items of business to consider beforehand. Can I first ask our clerk if any apologies have been received?
We have no apologies for absence, Chair. However, joining us online today are Assembly members Cooper, Bakari, Devonish and McCartney.
Thank you very much, and welcome all online. Item 2, declarations of interest. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Thank you. And could I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? No, thank you. As mentioned, item 3, minutes. As mentioned, we are unable to agree today the minutes of the meeting held on 20th October. Does anyone have any comments? Thank you. Section 4, summary list of actions. Can I ask the committee to note the complete outstanding and closed actions arising from previous meetings? Thank you. That now brings us to today's main item for discussion. Thank you for your patience. And the main item is the Green Bond Programme and GLA climate budgeting. We're joined today in the chamber once again by Catherine Barber. Welcome back. Catherine is Assistant Director, Environment and Energy for the GLA. Also rejoining us is Sam Longman, also welcome back, Head of Sustainability and Corporate Environment, TfL. We also have Stephen Dadswell, Head of Corporate Finance, TfL, and Prashant Vaze, Senior Fellow, Climate Bonds Initiative and former member of the UK Green Technical Advisory Group. I know it's your first time giving evidence to the committee, so welcome to the Assembly. And joining us remotely via Zoom is Zoe Jennings, Head of Climate Investment at Connected Places Catapult 3CI. Thank you for joining us today. If I can begin with Zoe, who's joining us online. Zoe, what should be the Mayor's primary objectives in delivering environmental projects funded by the Green Bond Programme? You're on mute. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Great. So yes, in answer to your question, thank you for inviting me here today. Our work at 3CI, at the Cities Commission for Climate Investment, has done a bit of research last year. And our report published in 2021 showed that 206 billion must be spent to achieve net zero pledges across the UK's 12 largest cities, including London. And in the capital alone, an anticipated investment required to retrofit the majority of homes to reach net zero is 98 billion. So obviously these figures are beyond the public purse to fund, which is why blending different sources of capital to fund net zero transition. So I think one of the key core goals of the Green Bonds Programme should be to establish a long-term financing opportunity to fund sustainable projects in London. And alongside the Bonds Programme, it's vital to establish a long-term pipeline of net zero projects. And to this end, we are working together with officers from the GLA and London councils to establish a London net zero project pipeline. I can talk about that in a bit more detail if you'd like.
Please, just for opening comments, it's appreciated.
Okay, so in terms of our pipeline work, we are basically establishing a national net zero project pipeline. And it's basically a common challenge to scaling up investment in net zero projects developed by the local government sector in the UK is that private sector investors can't easily identify and source investment opportunities. There are simply not enough identifiable and investment ready bankable projects constituting a single pipeline to which private investors and project developers can commit time, effort and funding to. So to address this, 3CI is working closely with a wide range of partners to establish a new national register of local and regional led bankable projects developed along a common format to deliver net zero outcomes. So as of today, the list of authorities that we've asked to submit project data, including members of core cities, London councils, the Scottish Cities Alliance, as well as Greater Manchester Combined Authority and GLA-led institutions, and TfL have been very heavily involved in this. So early insights suggest that the scale of the ambition contained within the current project pipeline has an estimated value of between 45 and 60 billion. So this is an early estimate based on data collected from nearly 1,000 schemes, 981 schemes to be precise, from 41 local and regional authorities in the UK. So most of the London boroughs actually, which is a really positive sign, 28 out of the 33 have already submitted project data, and with a total of 686 projects. So yes, early sort of indications show that a lot of these projects are commercial and domestic building decarbonisation projects, with transport, renewables and green infrastructure sort of following up. So yes, the level of detail included in the project pipeline varies from projects and programmes, and includes different maturities and different ideas for interventions. But the majority is sort of concept design at scoping stage and pre-development stage. But yes, that's just to give you a bit of a flavour of in terms of our national net zero project pipeline, and just to say that, you know, we are working and collaborating very closely with GLA on the London pipeline, which is a really positive sign.
Thanks, Zoe. That was really helpful. And can I just dig in a little bit further? If you have any types of environmental projects that the Mayor should be funding through the Green Bond proceeds?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's important to take a long-term holistic approach to funding sustainable projects instead of sort of cherry-picking the most attractive assets. But, and we look at 3CI is focusing on all key kind of urban infrastructure sectors relevant to net zero. And we're looking at 6 asset classes in particular. So commercial building decarbonisation, domestic building decarbonisation, renewable electricity generation, transport decarbonisation, waste management decarbonisation and green infrastructure. So there are kind of 6 sectors that asset classes that we think should focus on. And recent work has shown that place-based investment should be grounded in retrofit programs, so including solar PV, heat gasification, central heating, etc., at a building level, but also providing secondary interventions, so based on community requests and needs, to promoting a differentiated approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Prashant, if I can turn to you in the chamber. So the same first question again, really. What do you think the Mayor's primary objective should be with the Green Bonds programme? Oh, sorry, could you press your mic on as well? It's for face with the circles. There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, for inviting me along here. And just for the record, I should mention, I used to be a member of staff at Climate Bonds Initiative, and I remain as unpaid senior fellow there, a former member of GTAG, and I'm also a member of staff at London Council, so I know Zoe and Catherine quite well from that hat as well. But today I'm representing CBI.
Thanks for the transparency.
And just to answer your question, in terms of most of green bonds, there's a fairly well-defined taxonomy that's been developed internationally about how green bond proceeds may be spent. So this generally covers things like renewables, which, I mean, overall the global green bond market is something like £2 trillion at the moment. By far the largest part of this is renewable energy projects, and that's both the generation facilities, but also transmission and distribution networks associated with these. The next biggest is buildings, which, you know, obviously, given the kind of projects available on the pipeline that Zoe mentioned, is potentially a very large opportunity. The objective there should be that these assets are consistent with the kind of buildings we need for net zero. So it has to be fairly deep retrofits, or at least on the way to deep retrofits. Transport is a big one as well, and the sort of priority under most taxonomies is that transport should be, again, net zero. So they should be using electrification, and if not electrification, some kind of biofuel-based one, like bioethanol or something. And the other kind of types of assets that are often in taxonomies are water-based ones, particularly on the adaptation resilience side. Also, things like waste facilities, which are sort of aimed around the circular economy. The taxonomies, I think, are most applicable for this particular bond programme are either the EU one, which is a fairly well established one, and London might also want to consider the kind of work that GTAG is doing on defining or helping the Treasury define a UK taxonomy too.
Thank you very much. Catherine, if I can turn to you. What are the main objectives of the Green Bond Programme, and what should be the environmental priorities for bond-funded projects?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. So the kind of key objective of both the bond and the future financing facility, for which this is the first phase, is really to mobilise significant flows of private capital into environmental and green projects in London, because we know that public sector grants and support just cannot be enough to make those things happen. As we heard from Zoe, we're talking in the terms of tens of billions, perhaps £100 billion of investment needed to get London to net zero by 2030, as we all want, and that cannot come from the public purse, and obviously finances are tight at the moment. So the announcement that was made at the start of the year was both about supporting the net zero 2030 target and the Mayor's environment strategy. The Mayor also mentioned wider environmental goals, and that's why we talk about it as a green bond rather than a climate bond. So, for example, supporting better air quality, pollution prevention and control, biodiversity, urban greening, and then potentially also growing the green economy and boosting skills in London. So that's quite a wide definition. We've looked at sectors. The built environment is top of many people's list. It represents 2/3 of London's emissions, so that's an obvious choice. And we've heard that both from functional bodies of the GLA when we've spoken to them about opportunities, and also from boroughs when we've gone out with 3CI to ask about projects. That's been the most common thing that people have come back to us as energy efficiency, solar PV, retrofit, and so forth. Also opportunities in clean transportation, energy generation and storage, district energy schemes. There are a number of possible investments we could make.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Best.
Thanks very much, Chair. Catherine, I think the first question is, do you ever get deja vu? Because it was just yesterday we're doing this, but what is the methodology behind the GLA's allocation of funding to different environment projects?
Thank you, Assembly Member, and my apologies to you and colleagues who may have heard me say some of this yesterday at the Oversight Committee. So we're working our way towards investment criteria. We don't have them yet. We are looking at, as Prashant mentioned, there are existing taxonomies about what can count for investment, either through a climate bond or a green bond. So we've looked with interest at the green bond principles that we discussed yesterday. Thank you, Prashant, for the recommendation about the EU bond and the emerging UK bond taxonomy as well. We're aware of examples in the US where cities have moved faster than we have in this. So those definitions, those frameworks tend to be quite broad, so they will give you the whole field of projects that you can invest in. We will then have to make some decisions internally about what our priorities are. If one just said that carbon emission savings, for example, were top of the list, and as well as a financial return, that might send us in one direction. But as I've indicated, the Mayor has also said to us he wants to have that wider green impact, including air quality, biodiversity, jobs, skills, etc. And that is commendable in its sort of holistic view of what needs to change, but it can make it a bit harder to choose between projects because they'll each have different things to recommend them. So in the coming months, that is one of the top priorities, is turning the overall objectives into those investment criteria. It's something we've done in the past through the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund, which does have both carbon and energy saving criteria. So we need to define our own for the Green Bond Programme.
Thanks. And if I remember correctly yesterday, we should have that work by the end of this year.
So by the end of this year, one of the key things that we will have is returns through the climate budgeting process. And that's something that colleagues from TfL might want to share their experience of. But That's where we've been asking all the different parts of the GLA Group what it will take for them to get to net zero by 2030, and what they can fund themselves and which parts are unfunded but might be supported by the Green Bond Programme. So that is something that the Assembly will see through the budget returns and will be able to scrutinise. The actual criteria, I'm afraid I'm not going to commit to a date on that, but it's one of the key next steps that we have to take, and so certainly, if not this year, then early next year.
Yeah, I was going to say, you said that you're not going to commit to a date, but I mean, surely we can commit to a deadline of because if the first tranche of funding is going out in the first half of next year, then surely that's a document we should see the investment criteria by the latest January.
So we're working on our timeline, and I'd be happy to share more information when we're more confident in that, and when I can confirm it.
I do find it very concerning working towards that target. So I do think that as a committee we should know when we should be calling on you, when we should be when we should be scrutinising and saying we're expecting to see this. Will we see it by the end of February?
So I would like to be further on with this programme than we are. We came to the Assembly in July, I believe, to seek your support for appointing a green finance team. Up to September, I had the equivalent of one full-time person in my team who was actually bits and pieces of several different people who were also responsible for everything else to do with climate change mitigation, data reporting, net zero pathways, London Climate Action Week, running several programmes. It's only since middle of September that we've had anybody who is full-time dedicated to green finance. We're doing our best to get the programme set up, and I'm as eager as you are to make progress with it.
And this might be frustrating, but I'll ask again. So by February, will we have that investment criteria?
We're developing the work plan, and I will confirm it as soon as I can.
By March, will we have the investment criteria? But there must be a deadline where you think this is absolutely could not happen if we don't have investment criteria. And I know it may seem like a frustrating or nitpicky question, but I think it makes it very hard as a scrutiny member to know when we should be asking you, because you already highlighted yesterday the programme isn't as far along as it should be. And I feel concerned if we don't have any milestones on when this key bits of this project, like the investment criteria, if we don't know when that's supposed to come forward.
Sure. So, as I said yesterday, we hope to have the first wave of funding awarded to projects within the first half of next year. I think it would be a reasonable assumption, as you say, that by the end of the first quarter of next calendar year, we should therefore have the investment criteria.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. What proportion of the GLA's green bond proceeds do you anticipate to be allocated to retrofit initiatives?
So that will depend on the quality of projects that come forward. As I mentioned, it's been a very large component of what we've seen from the functional bodies. And we've been speaking with colleagues from TfL, Met Police, Fire Brigade and others over the last year about how they can get to net zero. So it's a big part of GLA Group emissions and therefore about our programming. So a lot of work has been done to identify projects. Many of the functional bodies have also applied for public sector decarbonisation scheme funding from the Department for Business. The success or otherwise of those bids may affect what they come to us for in terms of financing through the Green Bond. So we're waiting to hear the results of those applications, which should come through either December or January, I believe. So, retrofit I would expect to be quite a high proportion, and in terms of London Borough's returns to 3CI, London councils and ourselves about their pipeline, which is what Zoe was talking about, by far the majority of projects were retrofit. So there were a few projects in clean transportation, a few in solar PV, energy storage, etc. But retrofit was what people were most focused on.
I think so. And we heard this somewhat yesterday, and clearly it's known anyway, but London's nowhere near reaching the net zero target set by the Mayor. And a big part of that is due to the lack of skills and green skills in London. So what proportion do you think of the budget will be placed on projects that encourage or invest in green skills? Because clearly the rest of the projects, such as retrofit, depends on that.
So the funding that we'll have through the Green Bond Programme will be for capital investment. So we can't directly pay for skills development, but in any capital programme, you're employing people or you're hiring them, and you have an effect on the labour market. So as we look at investment criteria, as I mentioned, the Mayor has those wider objectives about growing the green economy, boosting skills in London. So we'll have to think about how we reflect that in the choice of projects. I think we spoke yesterday, and it's important to mention that project development is something that we want to support through the Green Finance Programme, and some of the £90 million that the Mayor has made available to support the Green Bond, we intend to spend on that project development. Currently, we have accelerators which are funded partly with EU funding and partly with the Mayor's core funding. That money runs out next year. It's been extremely helpful in developing projects for capital investment in London. Hundreds of public buildings have gone on to then seek capital investment. So as that runs out, we will then lack a source of support for that future pipeline. And that's something that we are looking to dedicate as a small part of the £90 million to helping those projects come forward. And again, that's to do with capacity. And I'm sure, again, colleagues will talk about some of the challenges of, there just aren't that many people out there who know how to develop these carbon-saving, energy-saving projects.
So I think, in a nutshell, basically this project won't work unless we get the green skills somehow to deliver it in London. So, to take this project singly, it's just not going to work unless something else is providing those green skills to make sure it works.
Yes, so it is only part of the picture of how we get to net zero. It's an important part of the capital investment that we want to make. The Mayor also funds green skills development, for example, through the adult education budget. So there are other programmes that we have as well.
Thanks. And what learning has the Mayor and the GLA taken from other organisations and countries to inform the development of bond-funded projects? And perhaps, Catherine, if you can't answer that, but maybe Prashant and Zoe, I think they might have actual examples of where this has perhaps gone wrong. All right.
I mean, just to sort of...
Yeah. Sure. Perhaps just to say something from the Mayor's own programme of Energy Efficiency Fund, which is sort of a precursor to the Green Bond. One of the lessons we learnt from that was the importance of the technical assistance programme, so that pipeline development. I think what we saw also was that a lot of project ideas came forward but needed a bit of hand-holding and coaching and technical assistance to get the project to the investable stage. Small organisations in particular don't always have the capacity to come up with information that's required for due diligence. So again, that sort of the fund manager role of helping to develop projects. A few examples from elsewhere in the world that we're aware of suggest that often you start relatively small and quite tightly focused on particular sectors, and then both expand the volume of investments, but also the number of sectors that you invest in. So, for example, New York Bank started just with clean energy generation. They later expanded to do clean transportation, water management, energy efficiency, and so forth. And they started with about £160 million equivalent of investment. Now they're well over £1 billion. Similarly, Connecticut Green Bank grew commensurately in size, but also that the ratio of private capital to public was found to grow as confidence grew in the scheme. So that went from a 4-to-1 leverage ratio to more than 8-to-1. So those are some examples we're aware of.
Just stepping back a little bit, I mean, the normal use of bonds is for capital programmes of some sort or other. I mean, the idea of a bond is obviously that it's a temporary loan. It has to be paid back at the end of the duration, the term. So normally it will be used for something which creates an asset, which can then be generating some sort of income stream. That's the sort of the way a typical private sector bond will work. So some of the things that Catherine it's been asked about education programs and stuff. It's not normally within the scope of a bond finance program. I've worked on a couple of bond issuances over the last few years. I was quite heavily involved with the Italian sovereign bond issuance. The kind of approach taken there is to first develop a prospectus in which we look at an EU taxonomy or whatever, and identify the kind of assets that we think we want the programme to fund. And in the case of Italy, we were looking very much at the green buildings, green transportation, some of the grid-related ones, because Italy was interested in converting its gas grid into a hydrogen grid, those kind of ideas there. The next step, once we kind of developed this kind of broad idea, was to write a prospectus. And that prospectus is there to invite investors to say, this is the kind of activities that your money will be used for. And that's quite an important part of it, really. We need to actually make sure it has credibility with the marketplace. One of the biggest issuers of green bonds is actually the UK government. So I think the UK government's green gilt, I think it's something like 16 billion so far. It's one of the very, very biggest programmes. The way that's being spent, it's I think government bonds are kind of unusual in that they're often not giving rise to assets themselves. What they're often doing is supporting other people to build assets. So examples are of things that were within the UK Green Gilt programme were things like the public sector decarbonisation programme. So payments for that were kind of counted as use of proceeds for the green bond, because the idea was that the public sector organisations would then go on and use that to green up their buildings, green up their, improve the energy efficiency. Other ones were things like the HUG, the Home Upgrade Grant, which is being used for off-gas grids. So payments that the UK government makes to local authorities for HUG, dispersed as HUG, were again counted as eligible use of proceeds. So the ideas I want to get across is that there needs to be some kind of underlying asset that's been created from the proceeds of the green bond. And this is something that can be kind of pulled out of the budgets that the Mayor or Catherine's team have got. I think, as Catherine mentioned, there are quite a few examples of non-sovereign public bodies issuing bonds, and some of the big ones are the muni bonds in the US. Some of the Scandinavian countries have issued bonds for retrofitting their own buildings, developing their public transport infrastructure, those kind of things where, again, there's capital outlay. You need to give some thought about how that money is going to get paid back at the end of the term of the bond. Often with government, they can essentially just draw on tax revenues. But that's something you need to factor in. Sometimes you might want to make a project which is itself generating revenue. And some of the transportation ones that TfL might have available, there is actually a revenue stream associated with the infrastructure that's being built. So, I mean, I would just say that you're in an unusual position that you can use tax revenue to repay the bond, but you do need to think about how that bond is going to get repaid.
Thanks, Prashant. Sorry, was there any particular cases that you could highlight for learning?
Yes, well, I wanted to pick up on that, actually. I mean, one of the things is people actually working collaboratively together, and the other thing I wanted to pick up on was the skills and capacity piece, and where cities have done well at this actually, by actually allocating funds for skills and capacity. We know that talking to nationally, we work with a lot of local authorities, and that's one of the big issues that comes up. And the lack of that. So one of the things that 3CI is actually planning on doing is developing...
Sorry to interrupt your flow, but would you mind moving slightly closer to your mic? We're just, you're cutting in and out.
Of course, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Is that better? That's okay, is that better?
Yep.
Yes, so 3CI is developing a national technical assistance programme. So basically the creation of a development fund which invests in the necessary capacity and skills to help bring projects forward for investment. And I think that, nationally, we need that national platform to help support local authorities and others to do that, to provide that investment. Obviously, the UK Investment Bank also has a role to play in that, and they are working with cities and regions to identify projects and start funding those now. But I think another key area of where this works really well is when authorities work very closely with the investment community to help shape and co-design investable propositions. One of the things that 3CI is hearing from the investment community is that they haven't got a a lot of investable propositions being brought forward to them from pipeline projects. So part of what we're doing at 3CI is actually hosting a number of regional investor events where it's a conversation, a platform between the investment community and local authorities with their pipeline projects to help build and shape investable propositions. They're not necessarily asking for money, but actually helping to co-design. So I think that's another area which, and we've held a number of these already. One in Bristol, which was very successful. We've got one in Glasgow in 2 weeks, and we would welcome working with the Mayor of London and GLA officers to push forward our London event, which we're planning on early next year.
Thanks. And just one final, hopefully really quick question for Catherine is whether the green bonds, you thought about using them for agriculture or if that's something that is achievable.
Great question. I don't think we've had any suggested projects from the agricultural sector, but if it met our environmental objectives, there's no reason why we shouldn't. As Prashant said, if there's an asset, if it produces a return.
Okay. Could we look into that work, and I'd be happy to meet outside of this meeting. Thanks.
Thank you. I love this agriculture suggestion as well. Just very quickly, before I bring in other Assembly members online, Catherine, I really applaud the holistic view that we're looking at here, so that it is a green bond rather than a climate bond or an environment bond. Obviously, a big part of that, as you said, is about investment and return of investment and bringing that in, but also a huge part is the sociability of it and the social service that matters. When it comes to a budget process, how will you set that out in terms of what prioritisation there is for the stated objectives?
So again, we need to decide that. But normally, I think we would be we'd be moving from the sort of overall objectives down to the investment criteria, which, as we've discussed, will contain both environmental objectives, but also things around project deliverability, the feasibility of delivering within the time frame of the bond, payback periods, return on investment, and so forth. So there's a balance there between the environmental criteria for investment and then the sort of due diligence ones as well. We'll publish a framework for what we expect to use the green bond on. That may be quite general, and then we'll have to think about whether within that we also publish criteria for potential applicants as well.
Brilliant. And in terms of that framework, do you know when you're planning to publish that? I realise I'm mimicking my colleague now.
Thank you. So where we publish a prospectus for the bond, that will depend on the moment where we actually issue a bond, assuming that market conditions return to it, being a favourable moment. Right now, we wouldn't be doing that. This month, interest rates have shot up too much. It's not we don't think we'd get a good deal, but we hope that situation will change in the coming months.
And then just my one other quick question is, so TfL did a green bond for cycling. Now, that doesn't necessarily bring in obvious revenue, but I hasten to add there's lots of good reasons to invest in cycling. How are you going to manage this relationship between, because I believe in the past bonds have only been used for assets that the GLA have owned that can be proven to bring in revenue. How will you set out the link for those that are not so obvious?
So I think Prashant may have examples of where this has happened in the past. And one of the things we're talking to boroughs and others about is where it is expenditure avoided rather than a revenue stream. Could those sorts of projects be included? For example, if we're helping on adaptation projects which lower the risk of flooding, which are then saving councils money in the medium to long term, can they consider that as a sort of implicit revenue stream? So I don't think we've got that defined yet, but we're aware that there are those sorts of projects as well.
Can I just on the flooding? So who would you go to, for instance, to put a number on that? Because obviously you're talking about hypotheticals or counterfactuals a lot of the time.
So I think we'd have to be turning to technical experts on that, who can sort of evaluate both what. We've probably got a decent idea about what the costs are currently to flood authorities about damage that is done when there's a flood, but exactly how much any intervention might then be expected to save, I don't think I would be the person judging that, but we would go to experts. Okay.
And Prashant, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of other sources of revenue when there isn't actually a kind of a revenue stream developed by the asset itself. I mean, the typical kind of examples might be impact investors, where there's somebody out there who's interested in the kind of non-market benefit that's been generated by a project. And this is actually quite a big pool of investors now. I mean, I'm always surprised at how many billions are being put through impact funds. So here, what you need to do is actually specify an asset and identify what is the kind of criteria by which you're delivering on. So it might be a certain amount of carbon saving, a certain amount of social equity, jobs creation, or whatever. And then the impact investor will say, well, if you hit your target, then I'm happy with that. So even though there's no pecuniary benefit to them, or a reduced pecuniary benefit to them, that might be enough for them. So that's one class of investors. I think another one that you mentioned before is kind of avoided costs. And I think a lot of the energy efficiency ones is exactly that. So the tricky thing is you have to look at the counterfactual of what the building or what the asset would have cost in terms of energy in the kind of absence of any investment. And then you have to then sort of create a revenue stream from the saving from that. And that is something which a number of kind of financial instruments have been developed to do. So this idea of what would have statistically been the energy consumption of that building in the absence of the bond, and therefore that would be the basis of a comfort charge. This is what the ongoing costs would have been in the absence of any intervention. And let's say that your typical bill would have been £1,000, and you've got some historical data to demonstrate that, then that is the comfort charge that will be available for distribution between the investors who are making that £1,000 shrink, and some of it will be shared with the tenants as well. So that, in fact, some of the work that 3CI has been funding with Bankers Without Boundaries is sort of developing that concept a bit further. I know that Camden's doing a bit of work on that as well with LNG and some of the kind of investors there. So that's kind of avoided costs basis. And I think I mean, those are the two main ones, but I think as a government or as a public body, you can choose to do things like bicycles lanes simply because you think it's something that's worth doing anyway. And that might be an alternative approach to saying, well, the kind of health benefits from that would have been worth, and then value those kind of benefits of you know, the better kind of health outcomes you're getting from encouraging active transport. There has been some thought about agricultural projects which are sort of reducing flood defence costs or flood damage costs of creating some kind of income stream from the insurance industry. I'm not aware that that's often been done, but the concept there is that if you're sort of developing some wetlands upstream of an area that's likely to be flooded, and therefore the likelihood of buildings downstream being flooded is reduced, then that will reduce the cost of payouts that the insurance industry make. So that's something that could be explored, though. I know of somebody who's trying to do these kind of catastrophe bonds, cat bonds, which are looking at you know, weather-related damage, and then if you're sort of changing making an investment to reduce the exposure to these kind of weather-related damages, that's something that the insurance industry will pay off. If you want, I can find a link to that. It's not something I'm particularly expert on, but I'm aware that these kind of concepts are existing.
Thank you. And Catherine, if I can just pick up on that too. So I just want to come back to this point of ownership, because it's clear to me when it's GLA owned how you link that to revenue, but what is the relationship between the ownership of the asset and the revenue stream?
So at the moment, for the green bond, our expectation is that the first wave of funding will be targeted at the GLA Group. That's functional bodies we've worked with very closely over the last year to develop their net zero 2030 plan. So that's our immediate thinking. Beyond that, as I mentioned, there's potential to work with London boroughs, anchor institutions, etc. I think I'd have to defer to my colleagues in London Treasury about their actual requirements, about how they secure that revenue stream. They're the technical experts on that. So I'm happy to follow up and provide some information on that if you'd like.
Would you be happy to write to the committee on that? Because I think that would
yes,
be of
I would.
interest. Thank you. I've got supplementary, so I'm going to go to Assemblymember Cooper and then Assemblymember Bukhari. Assemblymember Cooper.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hopefully. Okay, that's great. That was a really interesting discussion. And just on the point about flooding, there is actually an existing scheme where Thames Water, who obviously are a private company these days, put a load of money into doing exactly what Prashant was describing, because there was flooding of properties in the London Borough of Enfield, and they installed some flood defences, river meanders, It's actually a very nice place if you want to visit it. It's called Furze Farm, and it has prevented the flooding, which was incredibly expensive with them having to claim on the insurance. So they avoided considerable expenditure in the future by spending one set of money. But obviously they use their private resources to do that. I don't know whether that sort of thing would be something that could be funded through bonds, with councils working together with the GLA and Thames Water. But my question was more building on the discussion that we've just had, and we're both saying that it sort of falls within a taxonomy of other examples, but at the same time it is still quite cutting edge what we're doing. And I just wondered, if we do manage to go ahead and launch this all successfully and have the prospectus and then get the bonds program going, how much will this be likely to provide a sort of proof of concept of how the green bonds work, both for but potentially for central government, but for other regional governments and for local of the country? And I wondered if I could ask that to Zoe and then Prashant.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
So it's just about, if we do all of this successfully with the prospectus and then the launch and all the rest of it, does it, because it's still slightly cutting edge, although there are some examples, how much would that be likely to provide a further proof of concept for future issues, either by central government, but possibly by other regional governments and also local authorities? As I'm not sure at this stage that anyone beyond the GLA as a regional body has been doing much in this space, and obviously this is the first time we would be doing it as well.
Yeah, I mean, Prashant might be able to answer that probably a bit more accurately, I think.
Okay,
I'll keep him first short.
Prashant, how much do you think that this would sort of help others towards doing the same sort of thing? I mean, we're talking a lot about, what things that we need to do over the next 8 years, and I'm conscious that we're still talking about, something is new and cutting edge and not very many people are doing it. So if the GLA is able to do this, are we able to provide that inspiration for others that it can actually work?
Yeah, it's worth sort of separating out two separate documents that are produced in this kind of process. One is the Green Bond Framework, and this is really just a list of headings, and this is guiding investors about how, at some point in the future, you don't need to specify when, at some point in the future, this is the type of uses proceeds, and this is something that's published. You'll often then appoint a third-party verifier to sort of say that these are the projects we're doing, this is the savings of carbon, jobs, air quality, whatever it is you want to list on there, and that should be sort of taxonomy compliance. So that's one document that's produced, and that's kind of, in a way, freestanding, and that's where you'll be doing the performance metrics for the environmental and social objectives you might set for the bond, whether it's a green bond or a carbon bond or whatever. A separate document is the prospectus, and that's much more kind of market sensitive, and that's really to do with the pricing and the kind of the kind of environment in which it's being issued and launched. Just on a point of correction, there have been prospectuses, green bond frameworks written in the UK by local governments, in fact one in London. So the North London Waste Authority was contemplating doing a green bond, and I think it's the Municipal Bond Agency that was actually the issuing body. So it's certainly not without precedent even in the UK, and it's pretty common in other countries.
Yeah, I wasn't saying it was without precedent. I was just saying we're still sort of at an early stage.
We're an early stage, yeah.
To be that many, and so having a larger body like the GLA, which is obviously the regional authority, rather than smaller bodies like the North London Waste Authority, large as the North London Waste Authority may be, would that be something that would provide comfort and inspiration and move others further forward? Because we're sort of showing the proof of concept can work in London, so it could work in, I don't know, Tyne Tees, West Midlands Combined Authority, Manchester Combined Authority, and so on and so forth. Is it going to bring other larger bodies forward as well, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I think it can only be a good thing if people notice London. London is it's a big deal. So I think if London does something like this and shows that, part one is that it can actually identify, develop a framework which is identifying taxonomy compliant projects or investment opportunities. That's going to be of interest to the environments, investment environments. And UK was quite slow to issue a green gilt, but when it did, wow, it was big. I mean, 16 billion was, I think, it's probably one of the biggest ever issued, actually. So there was a huge wealth of investors who were interested in take-up. I think it was kind of oversubscribed by two and a half fold, which is not massive, but it's a significant oversubscription. So I'm sure that the investors will be interested. I'm sure there will be a lot of interest from other sister bodies, other metropolitan areas. But the issue is always going to be on the actual prospectus of will the market price it attractively, and that's going to be quite interesting as a separate exercise, I think.
Yeah, because bundling things together so that you've got, Catherine was talking about making the business case for individual projects, but then bundling that together into a prospectus to actually get the investor interest, I think is the sort of key to making it fly. And then if we go back to what Zoe was saying at the beginning, 500 million is still quite a small sum in comparison to the overall amounts that we're talking about needing to bring in to really decarbonise in the way that we know that we need to. So, getting this off the ground, making it, bundling things up and making it a success is absolutely critical, it seems to me, in terms of then moving forward with, doing it again and making it bigger, and not just in London, but over the whole country. Zoe, I think you were now wanting to come in.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think just to follow up on that, that's absolutely key in terms of for London to demonstrate this. I think is really important to lead by example for starters, and to showcase that it can happen, but also for the investment community. And I think that point's clear to demonstrate the scale of the opportunity is very, very important, because that's something where the investment community have not felt that it's been a viable opportunity for them to get the rates of return. So I think this is, very positive, very supportive of the Mayor's Green Bond Scheme, because I think that will help signal to the investment community that the scale of the opportunity is there.
Thank you, Chair. That was my follow-up.
Catherine's just indicating to come in as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, we should be a little bit humble. It isn't a world first. There are other cities in the US, Paris, Stockholm, others have issued green bonds, and that's good for us because it means we can learn from them. And even in the UK, there are local authorities who've issued green bonds. I think Islington, Camden, Warrington, a few others. But they're those ones are on a much, much smaller scale. It's £1 million. It's more about getting residents involved and investing in climate progress. As Zoe says, we're now operating, we hope, in London at the sort of scale that makes you start to think about billions, which makes those targets of 70 billion, 100 billion pounds of investment start to feel almost imaginable. So, it is an important step for us. Actually, Zoe and I are talking this afternoon with the chief executives of the M10 metropolitan mayors' regions exactly about the development of the pipeline and then our hopes for future financing. And we're proud that when 3CI went out to local authorities across the country and asked for their ideas to come back, out of 41 local authority returns, 28 of them came from London. So almost all the boroughs, as Zoe said, came up with ideas. And I would like to think that one of the reasons for that is that those boroughs are aware that the Mayor is making this financing available. Some of those other cities or other regions, it's still, we're coming forward with projects, but there isn't an immediate source of financing. And I think that's had a galvanising effect in London.
Okay, well, that really you're making my point for me. If we've got 28 out of the 32 boroughs, I'm leaving the city to one side because they have other means of doing these things. But there's only another 13 out of the, approximately 300 and so local authorities in the rest of the country. Well, good luck with the conversations with the M10 group this afternoon, because it's quite clear that there is a need to start pushing this out across the country. And yes, it's the bigger scale that I'm talking about, because obviously the Mayor has been investing in community energy, which is a smaller investment, and local authority is much smaller as well. But 500 million is starting to get up to being the kind of level of investment that we need to start with. Let's just put it that way. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And Catherine, would it be possible to provide the committee with a list of the 28 boroughs, or I guess a list of the exceptions?
So I think I might pass that one to Zoe from 3CI, because they've been leading that outreach nationally and we've just been involved in the London side.
Zoe, would that be possible to share with the committee?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Assembly Member Bokhari. Thanks for your patience.
Maybe, Chair, Zoe could share all 41 who've expressed interest, not just the 28 in London. So that would be of interest, I think. Thank you.
I'm seeing nods. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to pick up on the Chair's point about green bonds for cycling. There are some really exciting, bold initiatives that are taking place, run by organisations like MP Smarter Travel, that are literally trying to move businesses to zero-emission courier and delivery services, literally bikes for business. I'd like to know your thoughts on that, Catherine, and whether that would be part of the investment criteria that you'll be looking into.
Thank you very much. I'm really conscious I've got colleagues from TfL here who probably think about cycling even more than I do. I thought about cycling this morning with the tube strike, but
you did it. Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, we live and breathe cycling and all forms of sustainable transport. So as has already been said, actually, almost anything that TfL does is eligible for green bond criteria because we provide sustainable transport. And the bond that we issued in 2015 looked at those kind of broader projects that we could do to help move people towards public transport and walking and cycling. So in theory, yes, we could look at that. What we need to remember is that the green bond is still borrowing. It's not additional free money. So we need to look at that in the context of how we fund everything that we need to do. And in the kind of current climate, it means we've got some challenging decisions to make. So cycling could be one of the things, but one of the things we're focusing on, we're very pleased that the Mayor is making an additional option available to us through the Green Bond, and we've been working very closely with the GLA and very supportive of it. But we're particularly keen to identify projects that will have those avoided future energy costs, such as energy efficiency, decarbonising our buildings. But I also, going back to the conversation earlier about adaptation, one of the things we want to do over time is get much better at being able to quantify the financial impacts of climate change, because I think that will build a much stronger case for investing in adaptation to avoid those future costs.
Can I just pick up on that too? Because I asked Catherine that question earlier, and Catherine said, which was fair enough, we'll trust the technical experts on that. Could you maybe expand on what kind of technical experts those might be, or any kind of expansion of that answer?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so starting kind of broadly, I mean, this is a very exciting time, I think. We're going through this huge transition where we've had this big industrial revolution, and now we're having a second one. And I think that's actually very motivating for people at TfL. Our vision is to be the strong green heartbeat of London. But it is true that there's this high demand for skills across the economy, and that isn't just kind of hardcore fitting solar panels and things like that. That's applying green skills through every role that we do in terms of procurement colleagues, engineering and stuff like that. So we're putting in place a kind of suite of activities to upskill the business through carbon literacy training, much more targeted technical training. But all of this, when it comes to adaptation, to answer your question, really plays out in those kind of day-to-day hygiene factors, like how good is your systems at collecting the data you need to build that insight and those risk models to actually answer that question about what the future costs are. So when it comes to adaptation in particular, this is very much about your asset management strategy and are we maturing it in the face of the new risks that we see now in order to be able to build those risk models.
Assemblyman Best.
Sorry, and just maybe me, but you've lost me a little bit, Sam. Could you just, on the Chair's question, is there like some more concrete examples to understand that what that adaptation would mean in practice?
Yeah, so we need to, our main risks in terms of climate change is from flooding and heat, and particularly on the rail network. That kind of makes sense because these are fixed assets, so they're not quite so adaptable. When it comes to London, it's very difficult for us, almost impossible actually, to upgrade the drainage infrastructure to accommodate the kind of cloudburst that we see. So what we're doing, facilitated by the Mayor, is the Pan-London work to actually come up with a Pan-London strategy for how we can better manage that flooding so that we can minimise the disruption and the damage caused to our assets.
Thank you. I have a million other questions, but I'll keep moving on because otherwise some members will lose patience with me. Prashant, I know you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there are examples of some of the private sector entities doing the kind of risk modelling that we're hearing about here. So I was aware of some work that I think it was some of the kind of telecom providers in the US doing, where they were looking at the kind of damage that whenever a mobile mast is disrupted from extreme weather, the kind of payments they have to make for the system being out for so long, all the kind of costs that arise as a result of having to reimburse customers, lost revenue, all that kind of stuff. And there are some specialised sort of data analytic companies that have got large-scale kind of data scientists and meteorologists and these kind of people. There's one that, and they tend to be sort of teaming up now with some of the private sector banks. So there's one called Strontium, I think, in the US. There's quite a few like this. So there is a burgeoning green finance industry which is trying to do risk models on, especially investment in some of the adaptation technologies and resilience technologies, what the return is and actually monetizing those. So, but it's something that it does require a certain degree of investment in that kind of the skills and the data science capability or contracting that kind of thing out. I'm sure TfL's probably got those kind of skills in-house, but the boroughs, I think, are struggling sometimes.
Thank you. Sam, did you want to go again? Or? No. Okay, brilliant. I'll hand over to Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is to Catherine, and I just want to start looking at how you're going to measure some of the impact from the green bonds. And one of the principles, green bond principles, is around transparency and integrity. So perhaps I could just ask you, how are you proposing to measure the impact of any green bond for projects that we fund?
Thank you. So that will, of course, depend on the metrics that we choose, those investment criteria. Certain there'll be measures like carbon saving, energy saving. As we discussed, there may be a number of others included as well. The Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund produces every year updated statistics on how much energy and carbon the projects have saved. Those are published on the Mayor's website. And that's done at an aggregate level, so you can see the amount of money invested and then the total impact of that. We're looking to improve our monitoring and evaluation capacity in the environment and energy sphere in the GLA, and this is our very biggest programme that we're working on, so this will be one of our priorities.
Thank you. And can I just turn to TfL, and probably Sam, I think, is probably best to answer this, because TfL had its own green bond programme in 2015. And could you give any learning that came out of your experience about how you actually measure the impact of the projects that you worked on?
Yes, of course. So in 2015, we issued a green bond for 400 million, which was part of our overall £600 million borrowing. And if we hadn't done the green bond, we would have borrowed the money in other forms. So it was part of diversifying our, where we were, the investors that we were getting to borrow us, to lend us the money. At that time, the way we reported on the impacts was through our normal reporting that we did through our health, safety and environment, as it was then, annual report. So it was done in aggregate and looked at how we were reducing carbon and energy, increasing sustainable travel over time. Also, when we produced our financial sustainability plan as part of a condition of our funding agreement, we looked then at the overall impact of our investment on carbon emissions. What we need to do now, which we do regardless of the green bond anyway, we need to get much better at being able to quantify the benefits of individual actions so we can make better decisions on a day-to-day basis and as part of our annual business plan process. So I think it was part of our journey at improving our maturity, as I spoke about earlier, and I think what we recognise now is we need to take that to the next step in terms of providing that granularity. But it's not always easy. It's easier when you are looking at individual interventions such as decarbonising a building, removing gas, improving the heating fabric. It's more difficult when you're looking at interventions that improve mode shift, which is where we can have our biggest impact as a strategic authority to disentangle what has been the carbon benefit. We are getting better at that. We estimate as a result of TfL being formed in 2000, we've reduced the number of cars that would be on the road by about a million, and that equates to around 3 million tonnes of carbon. What we really want to do, actually, particularly given that we are so financially constrained, is we want to get a lot better at understanding and increasing the environmental impact we have through our maintenance and renewals activity, because I think that will help us make better decisions within the business planning process, but also make a stronger case for that investment. Obviously we need to provide a safe, reliable, affordable, accessible transport network. That's an important part of creating a sustainable city, but we should do that in a way that minimises environmental impacts as much as possible and actually helps regenerate the environment, particularly in London.
So I think what you're saying to me is that the quantitative stuff is quite easy, the qualitative stuff is actually quite a bit harder to assess. Is that a fair summation?
Probably the other way round. I think qualitatively, I think it's quite easy to create the narrative. It's quantifying that becomes more difficult. But since 2015, we have got a lot better, and we're developing tools in order to do that, particularly with things like embedded carbon and being able to understand the carbon impacts of our capital programme and seek to reduce those impacts through the life cycle of projects. That's an example of our increasing maturity.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then Zoe, if I can turn to you. Have you come up with, or have you got any ideas about how the GLA should measure the impact of its green bond funded projects, and perhaps what performance indicators we should be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think with regards to monitoring and measuring, I think it's really for the GLA to come up with that, because with regards to what metrics and what I don't know the assumptions that are involved and all the rest of it, so it's quite difficult to comment on that.
Okay, I don't know if any other members. Zach, I'm afraid I can't see.
That's okay. I've just realised Prashant's indicating.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a word or two about what is in taxonomy, and that might give a bit of help to answering this question. So a taxonomy, and I'll use the EU one, which is a pretty well-developed one. It has 6 different environmental themes. And it's, climate change is one, adaptation, pollution prevention, air quality, biodiversity, circular economy. So, and when you issue a green bond using this kind of taxonomy, you have to first commit to doing a significant contribution in at least one of those themes, and you can do more, and no significant harm in any other theme. And these are these taxonomies now are becoming very, very granular. So, with something like transportation, there will be sort of screening criteria that say that emissions have to be, I forget the number off the top of my head, but it's something like 50 grams of CO2 per vehicle kilometre. There'll be similar kind of metrics for haulage in terms of tonne kilometres. For electricity, for a long time the discussion was around 100 grams per kilowatt hour for electricity, which essentially just allows in renewables. So the taxonomies are highly granular. They often have criteria themselves for defining what is a qualifying asset and not, and you're generally expected to do no significant harm to any of the other 5 or 6 different themes. So in most part, these haven't been so well developed outside of climate mitigation. But the general principle is you need to make sure you keep to the other rules. So I mean, if there's rules about NOx emissions from an exhaust or something, you need to make sure you keep within all those things. So that, in a way, automatically gives you a set of performance factors. And bear in mind, most bonds are issued on the basis of funding a particular asset. So in the case of a transportation bond, it might be to electrify a certain amount of railway network. So just the act of electrification is itself complying with it. But if you're making a change which is switching to a hybrid bus or something, if it's performing to the standard of the taxonomy, then that will normally qualify. So just using the taxonomy and understanding beneath the skin of it will automatically spit out some of the performance criteria.
Thank you. And I take it, Catherine, you're alive to all that when you're going to be setting your performance indicators, and they will have to be individual to the particular project.
Yes, thank you. So I've been taking notes as Prashant has been talking. Thank you for the references. Yes, I mean, we're aware both of sort of wider things like the green bond principles, which set some of the expectations which cities often choose to follow with green bonds, and then the taxonomies that Prashant was describing. I think that the taxonomies, you apply each project as it comes to you against that taxonomy, but you don't, they exist independently. You don't write them for the project. It's the other way around. The projects come and sort of knock on the door, and you check them against those well-developed lists. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Assemblymember McCartney. I'm going to hand over to Assemblymember Bokhari.
Thank you, Chair. And just to continue on this theme, has the GLA considered publishing a scorecard or a dashboard online to show how the GLA is monitoring the impact of the green bond funded projects? Catherine?
Thank you. I think that comes back to the question about impact monitoring and then reporting as well. So we haven't defined that. I do think, clearly we need to be transparent about how we're investing the money and then the results that come out of it. And that feels to me like something we should be doing on an annual basis. MEIF does that already. It publishes its carbon and energy savings. We have other ways of reporting on our environment programmes. The London Environment Strategy Progress Report comes out every year. So that's an existing report. We just think we need to think about whether we join those things together, or whether the green finance programme is sufficiently large that it just merits its own reporting. But yeah.
Assemblymember Bokhari, Prashant's just indicating as well.
Yeah, I just thought that. Yeah.
Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah. So there is sort of something called the green bond principles, which sort of set out what the expectations are of a green bond, and these are generally legally binding, at least within the EU where the regulations have come in force. But these basically set out that there's two reports that are required. One is that when you take money off the investors, you have to do sort of an allocation report. So you have to record exactly how the money you've taken from investors is spent, project by project. That's a requirement. And it's generally good practice. It's not mandatory, but it's good practice to have an impact report. So, when you sort of commit to spend the money and when you're going to spend it by, so it has to be dispersed quite quickly. I think it's within 2 years generally. You then have to commit to publishing an impact report, and I think it has to be every 2 years. It takes a little bit of time, obviously, to mobilise some of this investment. So you don't expect a project to build a new building to be able to report immediately, but within 2 years of the bond being issued, the expectation is you will report against the technical criteria that are in the framework, the green bond framework that was issued before the bond was issued. And as Catherine says, the taxonomy is a fixed point. You don't change the taxonomy. That's something the governments or the EU give to you, and you have to sort of score your framework against the taxonomy.
Thank you. And Catherine, you were talking earlier about some of the challenges that you've had in terms of the team and the capacity that you have. Has the GLA appointed an independent reviewer of its green bond framework? And will you appoint an independent reviewer to check your compliance with the framework?
So we haven't done that yet. And if we subscribe to some of these principles, green bonds principles, depending what we choose to sort of measure ourselves against, some of those do indeed require that independent verifier. Happy to come back to the committee on that, but we haven't made that decision yet. I think we've had a considerable amount of external advice from the Green Finance Institute, who we commissioned to write advice for us on the setting up of a finance facility. And we hope to publish the report that they've written for us shortly with a response from the GLA. We've also had advice from Bloomberg Associates on a pro bono basis, who've looked at what other cities have done in setting up their green finance programmes in terms of staffing, skills, expertise, and so forth. So we do have those reference points, and we have been taking advice.
Thank you. I do want to touch on a little bit about the transparency and investor confidence. According to our notes, the ICMA have said that the green bond principles aims to promote transparency and integrity, and that's key for this kind of investment. And I am concerned that because perhaps there is a lack of staffing that you've mentioned before, that there has been some issues in terms of transparency and issues for our role in scrutiny. So, for example, I was looking through back some of the questions that my own group, the Liberal Democrat group, have done on green bonds, all written questions sent in since May, and absolutely zero answers on any of those questions from myself and from Caroline Pigeon, and I am concerned about that. Is there any response to that, and do you share my concern?
I do share that concern, and I will follow up to make sure that those questions get answers. When we've spoken to the steering committee, which is chaired by the Chief of Staff and represents a mixture of political appointees from the Mayor's office and also senior officers, we've looked at the ICMA green bond principles, which include that transparency, integrity, etc., that you've mentioned. We think that they are, very sensible principles. We're inclined to, to follow those principles. We need to take that decision formally, but it's certainly a good standard, I think, that lots of cities have chosen to follow, and I'm sorry that you haven't had a response to those questions.
Just lastly, on that line of integrity, and sometimes there are controversial decisions that might be made, and one of those is actually the Silvertown Tunnel project, which is controversial for many environmentalists and campaigners. And how can well-meaning investors be sure that money won't be used for such controversial projects like that many might disagree with?
So I don't know whether colleagues want to say anything about Silvertown from a TfL perspective, but very rigorous analysis has been done about the environmental impacts as well as the transport impacts of the tunnel. And as I've said, anything that we fund through the green bond proceeds would have to demonstrate environmental impacts, both in terms of carbon or, depending on the project, energy saving, air quality, biodiversity, etc. So we would only be using that money for any major project if it was able to meet those requirements.
Thank you. Sam, I don't know if you did want to come in on the Silvertown Tunnel.
No, I agree. I mean, as Catherine said, we have undertaken detailed environmental impact assessments and mitigated the environmental impacts sufficiently of the scheme. I think I go back to what I said earlier. In terms of additional borrowing, which this would be, we'd be looking at projects where there would be a direct financial benefit to TfL so that we could cover the repayment costs. And I think that means we would be focusing on building decarbonisation, energy efficiency, potentially something around electric vehicle charging where there might be a revenue if it was charging on our land, for example. So that's where our focus would be with this scheme and where it is in terms of the projects that we're developing.
Thank you. We're going to move to the next section, Section 2, Appetite and Capacity within the GLA Group. Can I go to Assembly Member Devenish, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning. And sorry, the rail strike means that I am virtual today rather than there with you. Before I ask my questions, I've been very interested in the debate. I just wondered, Chair, whether we could suggest that the Chief of Staff to the Mayor comes to the January meeting, because clearly I think a lot of the questions have been along the lines of there's not an awful lot of detail. I'm sure everybody on the panel is doing their very best, but I'm not sure if there's the real sense of urgency right from the top in terms of the Mayor. So maybe we could invite Mr. Bellamy to come with the Deputy Mayor in January to answer our questions. And one final point before I ask the actual questions I've been asked to ask, Chair. Obviously, it's COP27 this week, and I wondered whether anybody from the GLA group of families is there looking at best practice across green bonds at COP27.
So we look internationally at what other cities are doing, what other governments have done on green bonds. We're not represented at COP27. The Mayor and Deputy Mayor went to Buenos Aires recently for the World Mayors Summit, which was where global cities sent a very strong signal to national governments at COP27 about the urgent progress that is needed on the climate crisis, but we're not at COP27.
Okay. Thank you. By the way, I've got builders downstairs, so I apologise if you're hearing drilling there, Chair. My first question is to Catherine. What work has the GLA led to assess the appetite and the capacity within the GLA family group to deliver green bond funded projects? And again, like my colleagues, I'm asking for you to be as specific if you can with examples, please, in terms of a sense of urgency that we're getting on with this.
Yep. So Sam can testify to this, I'm sure. We have been tormenting the functional bodies on a fortnightly basis for the last year about their net zero 2030 plans. The Mayor wrote to the commissioners back before Christmas last year to say he expected to see plans for building decarbonisation, getting buildings to net zero, and also for he wanted to see their plans for fleets. And as a result, on a monthly basis, the Deputy Mayor for Environment has brought together senior representatives of the functional bodies to ask them about progress. And every month we've had ever more data. The functional bodies have conducted surveys of their estates. They've understood their buildings much better. The energy use, the potential carbon savings, what could be done, heat pumps, solar PV, building insulation, etc. And the same thing on fleet decarbonisation. And in between those monthly meetings, I chair an officers meeting where we also go through the data. We've used some of the Mayor's accelerator funding to support colleagues to develop projects. It's been good to see several applications put into the public sector decarbonisation scheme last month, which was one of the fruits of all of that research and coming up with projects. And you will be able to see the outcomes of that in the climate budget returns that go alongside the group budget process. So at the end of November, each functional body will be sharing information about how it can get to net zero 2030, what the immediate investments are that it commits to in the coming financial year. And then in December, we will also have information about what comes after those years, what is unfunded but necessary. And some of those projects can be potentially funded using the green bond proceeds. So that's where we're not committing out of our core budget, but there may be projects that do have paybacks which are viable. So I can assure you that we have been turning the screws on our colleagues and also on ourselves in City Hall to do that climate budget analysis. And that means that we now have over £200 million worth of potential projects that we think might be fundable by the green bond. But we need still to do a lot more interrogation of the potential business cases for those.
Assembly Member Devenish, Sam's indicating to come into.
I just wanted to back Catherine. I mean, she's joking about turning the screws and tormenting, but actually it's been incredibly positive. So regardless of the green bond, the transformation that we're seeing in this time and the support that the GLA have been providing through those specialist expertise through the accelerators, but also that regular contact, the climate budget in particular has really helped to bring more colleagues along on this agenda, particularly finance colleagues. And the collaboration across the GLA group with the other functional bodies has been absolutely fantastic and transformational. I genuinely mean that. As somebody, as I'm sure you can appreciate, is incredibly passionate about this. This is it's a really good time. There's a lot of work to do and a lot of maturing, but we are definitely accelerating on this agenda.
Well, I can believe that the TfL and the GLA are you assuring me that both the Met Police, with all their other concerns, and the London Fire Brigade are 100% behind this?
Yes, so we've had presentations. I'd like to commend those bodies. They have a lot else to do, as does TfL, a lot to think about, delivering, daily operations. 2030 may feel some way away to them, even though it's only 7.5 years away. But we've had now detailed analysis, detailed presentations about net zero plans from each of those functional bodies. The Met Police, I think, put in the highest number of applications to the public sector decarbonisation scheme, covering, I think, they identified 40 potential building retrofits. The London Fire Brigade has come up with a lot of ideas, for example, for solar PV on their stations. They are the leading functional body in terms of what percentage of their estate has solar on it. So really everybody has been contributing to this. And as Sam says, it has been a pleasure to watch them learning from one another. And we learn a lot as you do it as well.
Are you able to share those documents with the committee?
So in less than 2 weeks' time, 25th of November, comes the budget returns, which will include the climate budgets, which will have those net zero 2030, the outlines, and also the commitment to projects that will be funded. And that will come before the Assembly in the normal process of budgetary scrutiny.
Thank you. My next question is also for Catherine, Chair. What assessment has the GLA made of the risks associated with each functional body's ability to actually deliver these projects, and how, if at all, has this influenced the green bond proceeds allocation decisions, please?
Thank you. So decisions haven't yet been made about how the proceeds will be used. We'll need to look at the business cases in more detail, but deliverability will be one of the criteria that we consider. So that, it's great if people come to us and say we can save a lot of carbon, a lot of energy, have a better impact on the environment, but they have to be credible projects that can also be backed up with delivery. Through those monthly meetings with the Deputy Mayor for Environment, we've heard very loudly and clearly from functional body colleagues about some of the challenges they face, including in terms of staffing and having enough people with capacity to identify, develop and then manage projects. We have therefore been encouraging them, not just on the environment side, but also through the Mayor's conversations with commissioners, to see this as core business. The Mayor sends a very clear signal, I think, that taking action on climate change and on the environment is not optional, that it's a key risk to London, but it's also a key opportunity for us to be a greener, cleaner, healthier city. So I hope that in the budget returns we will see that reflected, and even though financial circumstances are tight, we hope to see that staffing commitments reflect that need for action.
You can stop saying budgets are tight, because remember TfL had a wonderful settlement from the government, but I'll move on. Is the Chief of Staff to the Mayor, does he come to those meetings with the Deputy Mayor, please?
Those monthly meetings, which are internal, the Deputy Chief of Staff and the Deputy Mayor both regularly attend. The Green Finance Programme is overseen by a steering committee, or steered by a steering committee, which the Chief of Staff himself chairs, and has also has the Deputy Chief of Staff, the Deputy Mayor for Environment, Policy Director, and then senior officials as well.
Thank you. And my next question, sorry, is also to you, Catherine. Your last one, and then I'll move on to somebody else. What is the GLA doing to ensure that the GLA Group bodies receive green bond funding, have the financial capacity to maximise the impact of these projects, please?
So there's been a lot of work between our Treasury and our finance colleagues and counterparts in the functional bodies, especially where it comes to the climate budgeting. And I think that's been a really positive experience this year. Not just to have environmentalists and sustainability experts talking to one another, although we love doing that, but really to have finance colleagues and chief finance officers in the room. Because fundamentally that's how you get to the heart of an organisation and its decision making and its prioritising as well. So it's been a very welcome signal that the Mayor has sent that he wants the climate and environment side to come together with finance as well. I don't know whether colleagues would like to comment on financial capacity. There'll be challenges around the management of projects and the reporting and so forth.
Thank you for the question. I think that is absolutely the point, really, that in a world of finite resource, we really need to make those resources stretch as far as possible. And obviously, in order to do that, what we want to look at is the impact, or the forecast impact of the schemes, and make sure we're delivering schemes that will have the maximum impact, the maximum bang for the buck. Overall, we've talked about, others have talked about this a number of times, that we really want to focus the investment as much as possible on schemes, projects, investments that have a tangible financial return. The reason for doing that is not that other schemes are any better or worse, but if the green bond is going to have to be repaid, the best way to leverage capacity is going to be through making sure as many schemes that it finances as possible are repaying themselves, and that in itself will add capacity to undertake more schemes in the future as and when they can be brought in, you know, depending on resources or identifying those schemes or making them investable.
I'll just add, another thing we're doing is we're looking at where there's alignment. So if we're upgrading a building anyway, say to improve staff facilities or make changes, can we go further and use additional funding to also make that building more efficient, decarbonise?
So buildings like, just to give an example, Paternoster is probably one of your biggest buildings. Is that going to be a real exemplar building? Is that in the plan?
The plan will be published on the 25th of November. So I know it's frustrating that you want to know the details of exactly what projects. What we do need to do is, regardless of what funding is available, we need to proactively develop a pipeline of investment grade proposals and then try to secure money in whichever way we can. So we're very much kind of in the foothills of what will be a much bigger programme of retrofitting and transforming our assets and our estate. But I'm unable to comment on particular proposals, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, my final question in terms of the programme is, it'll be very clear when you do publish, it'll be nice, because obviously we work in normally 4-year terms, or this year 3-year terms. So it'd be nice to know what by Q2 2024 we will be. So I'll leave that as a comment just to understand where we will be, because that's what all Assembly members certainly will be interested in. So moving on to Zoe, do you have any views on the way the GLA should decide where and with whom to fund projects from green bond proceeds, given that there are very different organisations, as we've already discussed, with distinct challenges within the GLA group, please?
Yes, thank you. So place-based investment in London requires successful collaboration, as we know, between the boroughs. I think in terms of identifying different projects, for us, 3CI's model is about a place-based approach because of the benefits that I sort of mentioned earlier. So where possible, rather than, I know that in terms of the initial pipeline data that we've got through is kind of a mix of multi-asset and single asset type projects. So I think it would be really important to try and focus on some of the multi-asset classes in an integrated place-based manner, so that we can maximise environmental impacts and get the benefits of scale where possible. So that's what I would say in terms of the 3CI approach.
Right, thank you very much. And my final question again is to you, Zoe. Do you have any views on what type of projects the GLA should fund for its green bonds proceeds for each of the organisations, TfL, Met Police, London Fire Brigade? I know I'm probably asking the question I've already asked in terms of asking you to tell me what you're going to tell me in a few weeks' time. But if you could add anything, if not, I'll hand back to the chair.
Well, I think it's probably more appropriate for the GLA and the functional bodies to identify their own projects rather than me trying to say where they should be allocated.
Sure. I'll hand back to the chair. Thank you very much. It's a very interesting conversation. I'm looking for more detail as quickly as obviously we can actually have it provided to us, Chair.
Thank you, Assembly Member Devenish. Prashant, that was very diplomatic. It's just to see if you want to be as diplomatic or if you have views, and then I'll come to Catherine.
Sure. I mean, basically, I'm going to slightly reiterate comments that Sam made. I mean, this is a loan. So, you know, at the moment, the green gilt, the yield on it's about 3.7%, I think. So we need to bear in mind that we have to pay, you know, the interest on the loan and pay the loan back. So I think one of the kind of guiding principles, you need to find relatively chunky projects that are going to deliver that kind of return and repay within the sort of duration of the 10-year or whatever the tenor of the bond is. I mean, the real kind of use of a green bond is it's massively expanding your ability to do stuff beyond the kind of constraints that central government is putting on you. So if you have projects, if GLA and its family has projects that require hundreds of millions of investments, and currently they're constrained because the kind of settlements from central governments and DLUC are not sufficient, this is where it comes in. But then the delicate kind of pricing issue of is it going to be cheaper than the Public Works Loan Board is going to be the one that the Treasury Department's going to think about. So yes, if you've got projects that need tens or hundreds of millions of pounds, you should be using this, but you've got to demonstrate that they have this kind of, they can make a return of around at least 4%.
Okay. Catherine, did you still want to come in?
Yes, just very briefly, I kind of wanted to draw the committee's attention to this idea that Zoe was talking about, the place-based package of projects for investment. So everything we've talked about up to now tends to be single types of project, solar PV, energy efficiency, clean transportation. It will tend to be one project with one revenue stream, and then we'd fold those together and aggregate into a group of projects that could be invested in through the green bond. One of the things that 3CI is doing, this is with a slightly longer time horizon, is to look at locations, look at places and think, are there some projects which would have a financial return and others that wouldn't, that could be bundled together? And then you might get some of the nature restoration, urban greening, things that you can't make money out of right now as regulatory incentives don't give just don't make that financially viable. But can you do the maths and present maybe a bundle of retrofit, LED lamps, EV charging points, some rewilding all together, and then make that attractive and present a single business case that investors would like? So all power to 3CI's elbow as they try to do this, and we're working with London councils to support it, even while this year we're probably not looking at that sort of project to invest in with the green bond, but we hope that kind of model gets off the ground as well in the near future.
It's potentially really exciting, and as Sam said, I think it's a really good time in this space of things coming together. Catherine, the Mayor's promised there's a retrofit revolution, but it's not yet been agreed where the scale of that investment's going to come from or the delivery. Now he has this carbon pathway plan. I'm just wondering, how could a green bond scheme scale up and match his accelerated carbon pathway plan?
It's a great question. I wish I had an answer to how we're going to retrofit, every home in London, and we don't. I think one of the easier ways in tends to be through social housing or housing organisations that own quite a large estate and therefore can access financing at the sort of scale we're talking about. We're not here with the green bond programme to lend people, £10,000, £20,000 to do their home. We'll be looking in the millions of pounds. So it will chip away at part of the problem, but not all of it. And there'll need to be separate schemes that then do incentivise those the sort of domestic homeowners and so forth. But Prashant may have expertise or information about this, but I am aware of an attempts in other cities, other countries, to bring together individual opportunities for investment and then to package those and parcel them up for investment. It's not something that the Mayor is currently doing with this programme, but I think it also needs to happen for finances to flow into the residential sector.
Yeah, this is what you were just alluding to, really, wasn't it, Prashant?
Okay, and this is me definitely not speaking as London Councils, because
get yourself to trouble.
So I'm quite heavily involved with this work within London Councils. So, just three different approaches I might just make mention of. One of the opportunities is where, as Catherine says, you have kind of existing estates which is owned by the social, by local authorities or social landlords, and that can be issued as a bond, and that's something that RSLs do quite a lot. RSLs are very used to issuing bonds already. That's how they finance a lot of their kind of construction of homes, and having a green bond is no big change. One of the other opportunities is where at a place level we create some kind of special purpose vehicle where this has a kind of a legal identity of its own. It can then raise revenue, issue bonds, those kind of ideas. And that's something that's the kind of conversation occurring within Camden with some of the financial players. That's the kind of conversation they're having. That's a great way of bringing in owner-occupiers as well. It's not easy to do, and you need to think about what the legislative backing is to enable this comfort charge that I mentioned earlier on to be kind of repaid, and the investor to sort of see this and in a way that even if a tenant moves on or an owner buys and sells the house, the contract with to be rewarded for the home improvements is still retained. So that's an issue. I know that 3CI and Zoe and colleagues there are doing work on those kind of legal issues of how do you attach an obligation to pay back for energy improvements to a home and not to an individual that may come and go over the period. The third approach, which was experimented with through the Green Deal 10-12 years ago, was where a freestanding entity was created, the Green Deal Funding Authority, effectively, which I think my recollection was essentially an entity which had a bank and a management consultancy at the heart of it. It was able to issue bonds, but then it offered to finance to anybody who wanted it, and then the charges recouped through the payment for power. So there are ways of using green bonds, but you need to sort of ensure that if you want to access all the 3.8 million homes in London, you cater for the different kind of tenures, and the easier ones are the ones we're going to attempt first, which are the kind of local authority owned ones. But it is quite a challenge actually thinking about how to construct something that allows green bond proceeds to be funneled into owner occupiers.
Assemblyman Best just has a clarification.
I just wanted to clarify something Catherine said, sorry, quickly. Did you say the Mayor can't offer into the thousands for retrofitting?
Sorry, what I was saying was that the proceeds of the green bond, which hope to reach up to £500 million, we won't be dispersing that to individual homes. So if it takes £10,000, £20,000 to retrofit an individual home, it's not that we will be using that for that scale of investment. We'll be doing it on the larger projects.
Not from green bonds, because I just said the Mayor does spend thousands on homes. So I just was
Thank
confused.
you very much for reminding me of that. Yes, I'm also responsible for the £40 million Warmer Homes programme, where we do go out to individual homes. That does come with central government funding. Most of that money comes from Vaze. And I'm sure the Mayor would also want me to say, in response to the Chair's question, that although this can't all come from public sector grant funding, no doubt we would like to see the government do more.
I think you might say that, yes. Assemblymember Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Sam, coming back to you, I'm just wondering what conversations or work has taken place between TfL and the GLA to develop proposals to fund a potential Greater London ULEZ through green bond proceeds?
In terms of the green bond, we're looking at all options for how that might be used. As I said earlier, pretty much anything we do would be eligible. And we haven't made any decisions yet. So, ULEZ will be one of the things that could be considered, like anything that's in our business plan. But that's probably all I can really say on that, to be honest.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in terms of sort of prioritising things around TfL that they might be interested in, do you have any sense of what you might be prioritising?
When it comes to the green bond, we'll be looking at environmental impact, but we also do, given our situation, really need to look at our financial constraints and financial benefits. So there's kind of a lot of moving parts, so to speak, that we're taking into consideration.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Catherine, sort of a similar question to you. What engagement have you or the Green Bond team led with TfL to explore potential uses for the Green Bond proceeds?
As I mentioned, we've had really detailed engagement with TfL and with all of the functional bodies about their net zero plans for buildings, for fleets, etc. We talked to them about all of their projects which have environmental benefits. The Greater London Ultra Low Emission Zone is one of those. But of course, the Mayor hasn't yet officially taken a decision to proceed with that. It will wait until he's reviewed the consultation responses and the analysis that goes alongside that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on very quickly on TfL's credit rating. And that has been in decline in recent years, and I am worried about whether that's a barrier to attracting potential investors at all. Can we have some comment on that, please?
Yes, you're absolutely right. I can only agree. Our credit rating is in decline as a result of our, I suppose, financial situation, which is not as strong as it was pre-pandemic, and especially unfortunately as a result of I think a perceived weakening of the support to TfL that it gets from central government, which has provided a lot of funding, but it has been seen as a weakening overall of support and a lack of a long-term funding agreement, which only runs to 2024. You're asking about whether you think that will provide that will create a barrier. I mean, certainly at the minute, our financial situation as TfL means that we have to be very, very prudent when it comes to further borrowing. So we need to look at what might be borrowed, whether it's via the green bond or for anything else, and whether we'll still be able to satisfy our need to be financially sustainable and to balance our operating account and cover interest on borrowing and renewals going forward, not just in the near term but also in the long term. So hopefully in the discussions, and these are discussions we haven't gotten into the detail yet with GLA, we'll be able to find a way for GLA to distribute funding from the green bond to TfL to undertake projects which are vital to achieving the net zero target, but in a way for TfL that we can feel meets our need for everything to be affordable. And the business plan, which is about to be weeks, months away from being shared and published, I think will hopefully take a lot of that into account if we can, to the extent that the green bond inevitably won't perfectly align with that, and as that funding is made available later on, then obviously we'll look to overlay and augment the business plan investments with further green investments. And if further funding was available by any means or further bond issuance took place, then we would obviously look to invest that sort of appropriately. Going forward, we need to be thinking about more than just the next sort of 18 months or 2 years that might come under the green bond, and how we're actually going to get to 2030 and how we're going to fulfill those really, we all know these are very stretching targets to achieve, to get the investment to achieve net carbon by 2030.
Thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Thanks, Chair. Sam, I was just wondered, you said you might look at the expanded ULEZ as something to invest in the green bonds. Would it be fair to say that you'll be looking at what will have the greatest impact on air quality when you assess how to spend that money?
I think we'd look more broadly at environmental impact, not just air quality, but also our financial constraints and any financial benefit that we could bring about from the investment to help cover the cost of repayment. But I would reiterate what Catherine said. It's not been decided that we're expanding ULEZ. That's still subject to
No, I'm saying, sorry. So I'm looking and saying, when you look at what you'll invest the green bonds in, will you be assessing what will have the greatest environmental impact through that green bond?
And deliverability, and whether it can be delivered within the green bond window, which is 2 months, 2 years forward, 3 years back normally.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at that, I mean, ULEZ, you've already said, is one option. So I take it, have you read the Jacobs independent assessment of what an expanded ULEZ would achieve?
I haven't, because I'm not that closely involved in ULEZ anymore. It used to be what I did, but now I focus on our own assets and our environmental performance as an organisation.
Okay. Just because I wondered if you'd be concerned when you read that independent report, when it says that there would be, the proposed scheme would have a negligible beneficial impact on carbon emissions in Greater London. decreases in NOx concentrations will be negligible on nature conservation sites, and so on, negligible impact across Greater London. So is that something you'd be slightly concerned about if we were investing in that for a green bond?
No, because I think the expanded ULEZ is going to have transformational impacts on the health of Londoners.
Even though the independent assessment says that it will have negligible impact, but you disagree?
Yeah, I think it'll be transformational health benefits as a result of the scheme, which is why
based on
the consultation and the benefits that were described as a result of that proposal.
What does that mean, based on the consultation?
Based on the health benefits that it would deliver and the numbers of people that it would improve air quality for.
Even though the assessment suggests it will have negligible impact on air quality?
Well, what I would say is I'm not actually prepared to be able to answer detailed questions on ULEZ, given that I've not read that independent report, but it is my perception that the scheme will be transformational. But it's not a scheme that I'm leading or have come prepared to talk about in detail, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, it's just because if it's something that we're investing the green bonds in, I'd like it to have an impact on London, as I'm sure everyone would, positive benefit.
Can I just add something to that? And just like Sam, I haven't read the Jacobs report, but I would question whether or not they have taken into account the indirect benefits of a ULEZ scheme. So if charging, and it wouldn't be clearly done on this basis, but if it can deliver a net surplus back to TfL that can be reinvested, that's only going to be reinvested in things that are going to be
I'll
better
just
for
cut you off and
Londoners.
say they have, and I would definitely recommend that everybody in TfL who is talking about ULEZ expansion reads the Jacobs report. If your questions are answered in the report, or your assertions are answered in the report.
I will then.
Catherine, just coming back to you, what discussions have taken place between the GLA and the London Fire Brigade about use of green bond proceeds to fund schemes?
So that's been part of these monthly conversations that we've had where we've asked for the net zero 2030 plans for buildings and for fleets. And as part of that, we've asked the Fire Brigade and all of the functional bodies to identify which parts of the investments could be which they're confident that they will be able to fund from their existing budget. It may be part of their normal renewal process, for example. Building is coming up for renovation, and at that moment they can just do the energy efficiency measures as sort of a standard part of it. Which things would need grant funding because there isn't a payback or because it is simply too long. Some of the measures that they're talking about might be 60 years plus in terms of generating a payback if they ever do. That's not the kind of thing that we would manage to fund with the green bond because it needs to have a quicker payback. And then we've asked them also which projects would be in that middle category for which it's not sort of grant subsidy, it's not core existing budget, but where might we use the green bond. So they've been segmenting those net zero plans accordingly, and we expect to see back on the 25th of November that what they are going to fund, and then in December what the remainder of the net zero 2030 measures are, including with green bond potential projects. So we do have some indications from them of things that they might like to bring to us. So they've mentioned solar PV, EV charging, fleet upgrades, removing gas and from their heat provision and electrifying their heat sources. Those are some examples of things that the Fire Brigade have mentioned to us.
Much on the same lines, is that a conversation you've also had with the Met?
Yes, see previous answer for how we've done this on a monthly basis. Things that they've mentioned to us, particularly building retrofits. A lot of the Met's emissions come from buildings. They've identified 40 building retrofits, which would reduce their emissions by 70%. And they've also, like the other functional bodies, talked to us about EV charging points.
And much again. Would the mayoral development corporations be able to fall into this at all? So I'm thinking obviously LLDC and OPDC.
Yes, we've also spoken to them. I'm afraid I don't have examples of what they've put forward, but they have also put forward ideas in the millions of pounds.
Thanks, Catherine. And just finally, this was kind of covered earlier, but obviously a great proportion of the air pollution in London, it comes from outside of London, and it's many of the other reasons why multi-stakeholder work is going to be really important, and this was mentioned earlier. Have you done much to reach out to those boroughs circling on any projects where we could come together? Could the green bonds work in conjunction with other authorities?
Very interesting question. No, we haven't looked beyond London's boundaries for now. I can take that away as a question. We'll think about it. I mean, I would say that even engaging with the functional bodies, the 32 London boroughs, City of London, the anchor institutions, so hospitals, universities, ambulance service, etc. That's quite a big job to talk to that number of authorities about their potential projects. And as I said, up to September, we had the equivalent of one person. We've just appointed a stakeholder manager. We'll have a second one. That was one of the reasons when I came to the Assembly Oversight Committee in summer to say that I thought I needed staff for this programme. It was because actually having those conversations, explaining what the Green Bond can do, hearing about projects and thinking how they fit together with the Mayor's aims, just takes time and effort. But I'm intrigued by your suggestion, and if you have any projects that you think are really good ones that would improve the quality of life and environment for Londoners, you're always interested to hear about them.
Amazing. As well as agriculture, perhaps that's something we can pick up after.
With pleasure.
Thank you. We're now going to move to our final section, which is on GLA climate budgeting. I'm going to hand over to Assemblymember Cooper.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. Have I popped back up?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'd like to start with Zoe, if I may. What do you think the GLA can learn from other cities or countries that have already developed climate budgeting or integrated climate budgeting into their annual budget setting processes? You're on mute though, Zoe.
All right.
Oh, I haven't said that for at least a week.
Sorry about that. Can you ask that again? I'm having some sound issues here.
Okay. What can the GLA learn from other cities or countries that have developed climate budgets or integrated climate budgeting into their annual budget setting processes?
Yeah, climate budgeting is not really particularly within our remit. It's not something that we really focus on at 3CI, I'm afraid.
Okay. I will move on to talking to Catherine, and maybe she can answer in relation to any other countries that where GLA is taking learning from, and also perhaps Catherine, you could say how the GLA's trip to Oslo has informed the approach to integrating climate budgeting into the budget setting processes.
Certainly. So the idea of climate budgeting actually came from Oslo in the first instance. So they were the pioneers in this field. London is one of the next wave of adopters of climate budgeting as an approach. I think one of the key lessons learnt there and that we're learning now is the power of having finance colleagues intimately involved in the net zero planning and wrestling with these difficult questions about how we're going to afford to make it happen. It's all very well having the environmental side of the house, my unit and others saying that net zero matters, that's our job, but we have to infect the body politic. We need the finance people who are pulling the levers to be really involved in solving those problems as well. So that's why climate budgeting exists, and the experience from Oslo and now from other cities shows that it is making a difference. I think another lesson that we learned was start with your own operations, start with the things that you can control, but then gradually widen your ambition so you have a wider impact on your city. So it's great if we get the GLA Group to net zero 2030. That will be challenging, and we're on a daily basis we're fighting to make it happen. But we are only a small part of the city's emissions, and so I think the next step will be to think perhaps next year about how do we think about budgeting, not just for our own expenditure, but also the parts of London life, economy, society, etc., on which we have an influence, and how do we start to feel responsible with our financial decision making and our choices about programmes and policies and so forth, that is having the effect to steer London's emissions, and then beyond that, there's there are things in London that we don't directly affect, but we still need to see emissions falling, across the whole city, and that's something that actually carbon budgeting in central government has forced departments to wrestle with as well. So that kind of widening out of your ambition is something that I think we will see over the next iterations of climate budgeting. And I just reiterate that this is very much being done in an international context. It's a C40 initiative in which London is taking part.
Thank you. I'm just going to pass over to Assembly Member Emma Best now, who's going to come in with a couple other points, and then I think it's going to come back to me for the final set of questions.
Thanks, Leonie. I just wondered, there's been several calls for more government funding to assist the project, and unless I've missed it, how much money? What's the figure?
I'm sorry, Assembly Member, I'm not sure which project you're referring to, whether that was to support green bonds.
The suggestion was that it needed more funding to work in conjunction with green bonds, and I wondered what that figure was.
Sorry, the Mayor has noted that if London received its fair share of central government funding that is directed towards net zero, we would be receiving, I think, £7 billion a year. I'm sorry, I can come back to you with the quote on that. The general point is that London does not receive from central government as much as it you would expect in terms of population, in terms of emissions, and we would like to see that share increasing. But I think we also have to recognise that, even if we got a higher share of what Vaze or other departments are able to make available, and even if they increase their spending, which probably not going to happen in the next fiscal statement, that would still be really significantly less than we need to move our city, to move the investments. And that's why we want to see private finance coming into this. That's the whole point of green bonds. So yes, we go to the UK Infrastructure Bank, for example, and tell them about what we're doing. We point out that we've got a really good pipeline of projects which they could also think about investing in, or putting money into the Mayor's finance facility. We think we could be a channel for some of the UKIB support. But the private finance is the essential part.
Thank you. Prashant, I just wanted to see if you had any expertise or anything to bring in about what the GLA could learn from other cities around the world around climate budgeting.
I don't know much about climate budgeting itself, but I think the point that Catherine made about bringing the treasurers into the room is quite important. So within climate bonds, two of our ex-members of staff were ex-treasurers within California, and I think they bring that kind of discipline of being serious about numbers, of making sure that the kind of key performance indicators are well expressed, and plus the treasurers are quite influential within most local government hierarchies. So often the sustainability officer doesn't have so much sway of capital decision making, capital allocation decisions. Treasurers have a much more so. So I think that once you get the finance departments to take climate budgeting seriously, it makes quite a big difference. Certainly when I was involved with the Italian green bond issuance, our interaction was entirely with Ministry of Finance, and it was quite gratifying to speak to the entity that's kind of determining how much departments are spending, and at the same time thinking about what the carbon efficiency of each of those spending decisions is. It's quite different to when you're working with the Ministries of Environment, where, frankly, they're not in a position to actually fulfil those aspirations to spend differently.
Chair of the Environment Committee, I have no idea what you mean. I'm going to pass over to Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. I just wanted to touch on learning from Norway. I mean, that was the first country to actually establish a ministry for environment back in 1972, and it took about 30 years before the UK then did the same thing. And I think there is concern that change is just way too slow. And when we've got countries that are so way ahead of us in terms of Oslo, that we could be doing a lot more, a lot quicker. For example, they account for private companies that lower their emissions, and when it comes to procurement of contracts, they're really, really explicitly clear on that. It'll be great to see the GLA doing very similar things like that. So is there anything else that you could just touch on in terms of those examples that you are doing?
So I'll just quickly jump in on that, just because the discussion about supply chains reminded me of the Mayor's Responsible Procurement Implementation Plan. The latest version, which has just been published, actually has requirements in there for suppliers to have carbon reduction plans, particularly for contracts over a certain size. And I think it's a good example of the well-rounded, broad approach we all need to take to this agenda. The estimate for TfL's emissions is that our upstream Scope 3 emissions is broadly twice the size of our operational emissions, so there's a real potential there for us to have an impact. But also, there's a lot we can learn from our suppliers, which are also very ambitious on this, so we do a lot of work directly with them. We had Zero Carbon Forum recently with our key suppliers, so that we can share tools, share learning, and what I see when I talk to our suppliers is a big ambition to do more on this agenda, and so I think, that's fantastic.
And perhaps just to give an example that I really like from that responsible procurement policy, for one of the requirements is that for suppliers from 2025 who are delivering to the GLA estate, their vehicles will need to be zero emission. Just something that we're now requiring. It will have an impact on the companies that supply us.
Thank you. I mean, it ties in really well with what we're looking into in the Economy Committee, because that transition, so for example, using cargo bikes instead of delivery vans, is something that I know that TfL are looking into quite closely. So seeing that move faster would be amazing, and part of the work that you could be doing. So Catherine, what support will the GLA's environment team provide to the wider GLA Group in developing its climate budgeting processes?
So it's been both the environment team, my climate change team, but also colleagues from the finance side of the house, led by Enver, Assistant Director, my colleague there, who've been working with the functional bodies on a regular basis, explaining to them first what this whole idea about climate budgeting is, why they should do it, why the Mayor has signed up for it, so they have to do it, but why they should voluntarily enter into it. We've been providing the support and discussions about the sort of technicalities of how you're measuring your estate, assessing the fleet, and so forth. So we've had experts in my team working alongside the functional bodies about those kind of practicalities of how do you decarbonise. But then also colleagues on the finance side saying, look, this year in the budget guidance that was published in summer, there was this thing which has not been there before. What does it mean? What's it about? Can we help you to prepare your returns? And I think one of the things that perhaps functional bodies were most uncomfortable with to start with was the fact that it will reveal that the net zero 2030 pathways, we now understand what it would take for each part of the group to get to net zero by the end of the decade, but we do not have the funding to do all of that. We don't have the financing to do it, or yet either. And talking about the fact that it's okay to say that, and that what comes back in November will show, at the end of November, will show the things we are committing to, and it will be tens of millions of pounds, maybe it'll be hundreds of millions when we add it all up, but it could be billions through this decade to get to a completely net zero carbon GLA group by 2030. And I think it's better that we show that. It's better that we show we've got a credible analysis of what it would take. And then we think about what can we fund, what can we finance, where do we not have the answers, but we've still got some years to come up with the answers. Because if you don't have that analysis, then there's no credibility, right? So if you have the analysis, at least you can do something with it. So I hope that the Assembly will receive the climate budget returns in that spirit, and yeah, we can work together to make sure that the plans do happen.
My final question is on that theme, but we've also got a need, and I'm sure you've raised this before, about the technical expertise as well. Are you getting that kind of support as well from the GLA environment team, so that we've got that best way of measuring those the contributions towards carbon reductions?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, it was because of the technical expertise that the GLA provided to us that we were able to produce our net zero plans, and we wouldn't have been able to do it without that. So that's got us to a really good place in terms of our baseline understanding and our model. There is still a lot more to do in terms of building the capability and the skills across TfL to turn that into delivery, and all those things I talked about earlier about maximising the environmental impact of everything that we do and being able to capture and quantify that and make better decisions.
Thank you. I know, Prashant, you wanted to come in.
I was going to make a comment about something that I think was spoken about a few minutes ago now, so I'm not sure how pertinent it is, but one of the green bonds that was issued by Apple quite a few years ago now was an unusual one because Apple itself is not short of cash. It doesn't need to go to the debt capital markets. But what it did was, I think, issued about a $2 billion bond, which is a huge one at that time, and it was really for its supply chain. So it was lending the money out to its supply chain on the basis that it could access capital far more cheaply than some of its suppliers. And it's interesting how the tech companies in the US have generally invested, looked at their own kind of carbon footprint, and seen a lot of it's actually to do with scope 3 emissions upstream ones, and really invested big time in supply chain and also in electricity generation, so especially some of the cloud-based systems. Most of their emissions are really from the operation of the actual service, and it's making sure that they've got green electricity. It's interesting, this a really sort of critical look at where your environmental impacts are might be actually not within the ownership of the assets of the GLA family itself, but in its supply chain. For instance, I don't know, green cement is an option or something.
Thank you. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you. Sorry, there was a bit of confusion on my part between Assemblymember Bakari and Assemblymember Best there, I think. So obviously TfL probably, I mean, you're talking there, Prashant, about Apple leveraging on behalf of smaller companies, which I think is great, and why I'm so interested to see green bonds at the regional level. But also within the GLA group, obviously we're, going to Norway and bringing back their expertise, but we've got expertise within the GLA group as well, haven't we? In the sense that TfL has already previously issued green bonds for some of its work, so is maybe a bit further ahead than other parts of the group. So how is, this is one for Sam, how is TfL feeding in its environmental expertise into the climate budgeting process, assuming that some of the information that has already been gathered by TfL is relevant not just to green bonds, but is also relevant to climate budgeting?
Thank you. Yeah, it was actually very much a collaborative process. So there was a steering group that was set up with the GLA environment and finance colleagues and environment and finance colleagues from all the functional bodies. And we actually worked together to produce that guidance to make sure it was fit for purpose and would maximise the impact. So whilst I've talked about the skills gaps that we have, we actually also do have a lot of skills and capability and understanding on this agenda. And I think GLA would agree that that was really valuable. And also, given our size as the biggest part of the GLA family, I think it was really important that we maximise the impact that we could have on our emissions as a result of the climate budgeting process.
So maybe I could turn to you, Catherine, then. I mean, I know that we've got this 25th of November date, but what do you expect to see across the GLA group through the process of developing the climate budget. How do you think that's going to manifest itself? Do you think we're going to identify, as Apple did, for example, that we need to be thinking not just about our own emissions, but also the emissions of our suppliers? Is that something that we are going to be identifying, or are there particular functional bodies that we're going to notice are possibly under delivering against their net zero commitments?
So I think that all of us have work to do to get to net zero 2030. It won't be easy for any part of the GLA group. It is going to take a very big effort, but at least analysing where our emissions come from and what the options are for tackling them has been an important thing to do this year. The ongoing work of the Environment and Energy Unit in the GLA with partners across the group, and now the climate budgeting process have helped with that. What else do I expect to see coming out of that, as well as the returns? I expect to see some more worried finance colleagues, by which I mean it's sort of a problem shared for the those who work on climate and environment. And if finance colleagues weren't already, worried about the climate crisis, hopefully we've helped to involve them in that problem even more this year, with just kind of understanding the scale of change that is needed, and the fact that it has to happen within one generation of investment. I think that's been a very big change that we've seen as the Mayor moved the target forward from 2050 to 2030, where estates managers, for example, might have thought, well, I'll replace my gas boiler once more with another gas boiler, and then after that, like later, sometime in the 2040s, we'll do a heat pump. That sort of thinking has had to change because of the accelerated time frame, and I think that's come out through the climate budgeting process as well. I don't know, maybe Sam, you've been involved in the conversations about the impact on supply chains. I'm not sure if we're going to see anything about that specifically in the 25th of November reports.
I'll come back to that. I just want to quickly build on what you said. I would actually expect to see, and we are seeing, without being too kind of trite, people being excited by this transition. This is an opportunity for us to develop new tools, to learn new things, and to increase our positive impact that we have on London. The environmental sustainability and financial sustainability are not separate, they're inextricably linked. We saw that in the Stern review in 2006. That it would be cheaper to deal with climate change than it would to bear the costs of it. And that is the case for us just within our own organisation, our own operational emissions. The more we can improve energy efficiency, transition to this new technology in a way that's smooth and aligned with all the other objectives we need to deal with, the stronger we will be financially in the longer term, the more we will be attractive to customers and people wanting to work with us and for us. So this is really not two separate things. This is about how we make our organisation fit for the future and sustainable in the longer term. When it comes to a supply chain, I think what I'd go back to is, look, we're looking at all the potential options, but we do want to focus on those things, given our financial situation. I'm going to repeat myself, where there is a financial benefit, it works within our financial constraints, that it's deliverable, and then it maximises impacts on the environment. So I can tell you what I've been focusing on, and that has been looking at our own operational emissions, particularly in terms of decarbonising our buildings. Most of our operational emissions comes from our buses, and we're actually we're world leaders, certainly in Western Europe, when it comes to zero-emission buses, and we've got a plan there. We've got a plan for our electricity supply through power purchasing agreements. Where I really want to focus efforts is how do we actually save money by improving the energy efficiency of our assets.
I mean, I understand all of that, but I mean, surely we need to be going further during the climate budgeting process, moving slightly away from the green bonds. I mean, for example, my understanding is that the people who have the largest electricity bill in the whole of London is London Underground, and I can't be the only person who, when I travel around on the the tube network during the day and notice that there are unused escalators going up and down. I mean, are we actually going to be sort of doing some aspects of climate budgeting that include actually trying to, reduce our energy use in terms of operational energy use to electricity by turning off escalators where we clearly don't need to have two running during the day, where there are two that go up or two that go down, which there are now at many of the big interchanges, as well as doing the, reducing embodied carbon in our new buildings, reducing operational carbon that is being used in our buses and so on and so forth. I mean, are we going to be doing, is it going to be going across the whole piece? And then I do want to come back to Catherine and say, do you think we have any laggards within the GLA group? Because you kind of dodged that question as to whether anyone is at the back of the queue. I don't want Sam to answer that, obviously.
Yeah. Yes, so all those things that you've identified are things we need to get better on regardless of climate budgeting. We need to think about how we operate, where we can turn off lights, where we can slow down escalators, where we can switch them off. And I think that's part of the education communication program we're doing around carbon literacy, around improving our ability to disaggregate the energy and carbon performance of particular business areas so we can really drive that up. But energy efficiency is definitely one of the things we're looking at, particularly in terms of traction efficiency and how we run our trains and what technology we can use there. One of the things I forgot to say in answer to the previous question about supply chains, as you'll be aware when you look at the climate budgeting guidance, what we're doing to begin with is we're looking at the scope 1 and 2 of the functional bodies. But in the future, we will then move to looking at scope 1 and 2 for London as a whole. So that means London's whole transport system. And then we'll go on to look at scope 1, 2 and 3 for London. So that includes our supply chains. And the bit I'm most excited about, and I think is often forgotten, is we will then go on to look at not just carbon, but what is required to adapt and make London resilient, which is, for me, one of the most important things that we need to focus on.
Well, yes, there's quite a lot of adaptation that is going to be required because unfortunately not enough people paid attention to the Stern report, which you just referred to. But coming back to you, Catherine, is there anybody, I mean, I think we said that the fire brigade have done particularly well in terms of what they've done with their buildings. However, I can't believe that applies to their appliances. Where are we going with this? And is there anyone who's sort of at the front of the queue in terms of moving towards net zero commitments and energy reduction? Anyone who's at the front, anyone who's therefore at the back?
So I'd say that all of the functional bodies have shown a really commendable commitment to engaging with us on the details of their net zero plans and on how they will be financing them, even when that's sometimes an uncomfortable conversation because it may mean changes in how they operate some of their assumptions about how they do business. So, TfL, as Sam said, have surveyed a huge estate and, that I think has been an outstanding achievement to have just kind of got your minds around all of those buildings, all those assets, and to understand how that carbon footprint could be reduced, and of course sharing experience of the TfL Green Bond that was issued a few years ago. The Met Police Service have developed, I think, the most practical project for submission to the public sector decarbonisation scheme. We hope they'll get a good chunk of that money, bringing that to London. London Fire Brigade has the highest share of their buildings with solar PV on. They've also commissioned the first zero emission pumping appliance. I think in the UK, in the world, that's a real groundbreaker. Lots of good things going on across the GLA group, and we're all trying to inspire one another to do more.
I can see I can't tempt you into saying who's at the back of the queue and who's at the front of the queue. So instead, I'm going to ask you about where the climate budgeting process identifies gaps in policy. So, we've been doing a lot around, solar PV, as you say, but we need to fit more heat pumps or something else. What are the likely next steps? Are we going to be developing an action plan that is going to set out a set of initiatives that will further drive carbon emissions so that when we go through the iterative process of doing carbon budgeting next year and the year after, we've got some things that we've identified from this year's process that we want to make sure we include as areas to work on to help us move forward on this? And that's to Catherine.
Yeah, cogitating on that. So, very interesting question. I don't know how much commentary we will get back in the actual climate budget returns, but certainly as we've done the analysis of, where do we have incentives? Where is it therefore financially viable to either invest our own money through our core budget or to use proceeds of the green bond to fund projects? And where are the ones which have got really long payback period or maybe no payback at all? That is what indicates to us that there's a policy gap essentially. One example of work we've done recently, which I think we've just shared with the Assembly, with this committee, is our research on planning requirements for solar PV, where those in London are stricter than the sort of national requirements and might be discouraging installation of that clean energy source. So there are kind of indications, whether it's planning, energy, retrofit, etc., where policy could change either at a national level or at a London level, and that's something we just work on constantly, not only as part of the climate budget process.
What about things like vehicle to grid? I mean, there's a lot of people who've been talking about increasing the amount of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and obviously that is to enable the electric vehicles to pull power out of the grid. Although I am receiving some complaints from some people that just attaching to the facilities in lampposts in certain boroughs is actually very expensive. But obviously that then creates, and I'm not sure whether this has been calibrated, a massive increase in demand for electricity as we move away from fossil fuel internal combustion engine fired up vehicles. Are we also starting to investigate in your team how we might facilitate and work with boroughs on projects, or is this the kind of project that the green bonds might fund for vehicle to grid, where vehicles are supplying back into the grid rather than just always pulling out of the grid? And I'm going to start with Catherine, but I'm very happy to hear from Sam or Prashant or anybody.
So Sam and I have been sort of exchanging thoughts on this. So I think some of the grid strengthening needs to be done. It's not the GLA specifically that is the investor there. One of the conversations we have with Ofgem, with the grid operator as well, is around the fact that London has got an earlier target to hit net zero than the country as a whole, although many different cities and local authorities are declaring their own ambitious targets sooner than 2052. And that means that we expect to see a level of demand, as you've said, for electricity that may go ahead of the national picture. And the GLA and the Mayor have therefore made representations saying, please strengthen the grid. We're seeing this with new developments. We're seeing this both for heat sources and then for vehicle charging as well, that it is needed. As that is proven year on year, that electricity is sort of becoming a bigger proportion of our energy use, that becomes a more credible story, and we lobby ever more. But Sam, I think you wanted to come in on West London in particular.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is an important challenge, and it's something we should be doing regardless of targets, because there's a real opportunity here to save money, to build resilience within the system. And I think the work that's going on in West London, a couple of other places, I think Enfield and the Isle of Dogs, in terms of local area energy planning. So there's 10 boroughs working together, the GLA infrastructure team, TfL, to basically understand the needs and the opportunities within a particular area. It goes back to that place-based approach. And once you've got that, you can then start to develop collaborative projects on the ground. One of the things I always say about this transition is it's going to be fast, it's accelerating, and it's going to be organic. And the only way we can maximise those opportunities is to be out there building those partnerships and working together. It's not just about, for TfL, us and our own assets. It's how can we be part of the energy transition of London. And I think examples such as using waste heat from the tube and feeding that into district heating networks and providing heat to schools and homes sport community centres is a great example of how we should be working together, because it's much more cost effective. It's also can help reduce disruption if we're all working together to understand the capacity needs in an area. You can do that upgrade once rather than ripping up the road several times each time somebody needs a bit of extra capacity. So there's a lot of work going on at the moment, but there's much more to do. And that also lends itself to the point we keep making about the capacity and the skills gap that we're seeing right across the UK and the world on this agenda.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I asked the question, because clearly this is an area where it's not something where the GLA can just work on this alone. It has to be done in conjunction, obviously, with talking to Ofgem, but also with the local authorities, and also talking to all the other players. We can't achieve the energy transformation for the whole of London without involving everybody, which is why at the beginning I was talking about bundling things together and making a prospectus that does take that approach. And I think the place-based approach is very good. But I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you. Unless there's someone else who wanted to come in.
Thank you. Sorry, Prashant, I know you indicated you wanted to speak earlier.
Yeah, so on the vehicle to grid particular issue, this is something where there's an opportunity for GLA to work probably with UK Power Networks and London councils as well. UK Power Networks has currently got about 10-12 people who are kind of involved with local area energy plans, and this concept of vehicle to grid, where the vehicle battery is used for temporary storage and can return power back into the grid, is a particular way of sort of reducing some of the peak demand at hours of the day where demand is very, very high. At the moment, there hasn't really been much need for this, so the amount of actual investigation of this is quite limited. Ofgem is supporting this through their RIO framework, where they're incentivising the distribution network operators to undertake research, to work with local governments, with vehicle manufacturers, all these kind of people. So UK Power Networks has been incredibly helpful on this, I think, on this. I've, in my other job, had a lot of engagement with GLA on the power team on that.
It may not be something that we need right now, but I'm just trying to think about as we move into this future. And as Sam was saying, the faster we get there, the sooner we're going to need this. But I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you for that, Prashant. That was very helpful.
Thank you. Catherine, I'm sure it's an administration error more than anything, but the solar action plan and planning, I don't think actually reached a committee. And when we've looked on the website, we can't find the report.
Gasp. Okay, I'll make sure it comes to you. I apologise for that. I know that it's complete, and I believe we can send that over. Yeah.
You've given massive amount of detail this morning, so I'm sorry to end on that very small gap that's on there, but appreciated. Thank you very much to all our guests, including Zoe online. That was a really, really useful session. We've now reached the end of the Q&A, but I'd like to thank you all for attending. We now have a few small items of business to deal with, so feel free to leave the chamber, or feel free to hang around if you love small items of business. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion?
Noted.
Thank you. The committee is recommended to note its work programme. Is that agreed?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the Environment Committee is scheduled for 7th of December 2022 at 2 p.m. in the Chamber City Hall. I have no urgent business, which concludes today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.